Hmm. Hello. I want to begin by apologizing that I have yet to put this on canvas. All right, so obviously you've not even had the chance to get ahead of the game and take a look at it. So my apologies. Okay, and I'll get your names down and all right, let's see here. As I'm doing this, are there any comments, anything that you'd like to share with me? Because oftentimes, if it's something that pertains to the class, the class itself could benefit hearing it. Anything from anyone? Feel free to unmute yourself. Okay.
Yes, I have a question. Oh.
Sure.
I wanted to know, when you record the Zoom meetings, um, do you post them, or is it just when you're on the meeting that's when we have to attend?
No, I'm supposed to post them. I apologize. It is my wife's schedule has been hectic and I rely upon her to do it for me. Um
Oh, okay. That's
I
okay.
I went
Thank
to
you.
a I went to a meeting and I've tried to do it twice and I still can't do it even having gone to the meeting at on campus. I'm so sorry. I'm so technologically inept.
That's
Um
okay. That's okay. Thank you.
so I'm so sorry, Elizabeth.
That's okay.
I'm still trying to get it a hang of it. But yeah, I will ask my wife and she'll be happy to do that. Okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you so much. I
No
appreciate it.
problem. But I'm writing it down right now. Post videos with 3 exclamation points. Okay. Not a problem. Okay, so I'm gonna share this video or share this page. So can everyone see that? Is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, so what I do, right, is it's pretty familiar technique is I balance court history with revisionist history in my class. And then with court history, remember it's kind of the romantic history, it's pro-US, it's pro-US leaders, etc. And then revisionist kind of tears into them, right? And is much more critical of them. So I do both in this assignment as well. And so in gaining an empire, all right, um um the term imperialism, it never has bode well since the civil rights movement. Okay. But believe it or not, prior to the civil rights movement, it there were many generations in which it did. It was a badge of honor. Um, but not since then, certainly, right? So to be called, labeled an imperialist has been a very, very derogatory term. It's nothing less than a bully, right? Over an autonomous people, etc. And I'm sorry, I'm due for another inhaler. I have asthma, so sorry if I'm very breathy in my lecture. So at any rate, you can't deny that the United States gained um, sovereignty over over other islands, over sovereign islands and people and their nations. You can't deny that in court history, right? In playing the bully. So what the best thing that you can do is justify why we did it, right? In court history. So that's what we try to do in the first couple numbers, right? We try to justify why we did it. So that's exactly what we do in the first couple numbers. All right. So number one is as opposed to material determinism. Material determinism, right? It's just a fancy word for contending that it is like with Marxist history, that it is material resources and the desire for them that dictates the direction of history, right? So desire for oil in particular, right? And other natural resources that has spun history in the direction in which it is gone. We're continuing on number one, that it's ideas that have really been the impetus in pushing Americans and others in Western civilization to feeling compelled. And compelled, right, is the operative word for number one. That we literally felt a need, not a desire, but an absolute necessity to become more aggressive in our foreign policy during the 1890s and the first decade of the 1900s. Okay, why this necessity? Because of ideas that were percolating in academia that made their way into the common parlance and into the common vernacular. Okay, so what were some of those ideas? Well, you have ideas like social Darwinism, right? So Darwin wrote his famous book in 1859, and then he had people like Huxley, right? Who and Spencer, who popularized it much more than he did, who can and put it in a societal context and contended, right, that society, that the world is inherently hostile, right, and that societies at large, just like a biological organism, have to behave in such a way, because to them it's all volitional, it's all by choice up to a society, much more than it is to a biological organism. Because remember with Darwin, he said it was a lot by chance, right, that they had to have the lucky mutations, right, the extra long legs or tail or eyes or something that gave them that edge over their competitors. And then those who had that edge would have sexual selection and breed and pass those lucky genes on to their progeny, and they would have the edge over their competitors, and they would breed out, and the others would get weeded out, right, in the hostile environment of natural selection. But with societies, they said it was by chance rather than random mutations, or it was by choice. And so you had to choose technological innovation. You had to choose militarization. You had to choose democratic evolution and so forth. And because if you didn't and you stayed archaic and old school, you were going to get gobbled up. And they pointed to like the Ottoman Empire of Turkey and these other old archaic empires that were dying out seemingly as their evidence that they were not keeping up and they were paying the price. Okay, and so social Darwinism was big at this time. Okay, and then along with social Darwinism is they contended that you had Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche contended that society was becoming too decadent, that you had other writers along the same lines that were writing that there were cycles of empires, and they started off with this this kind of barbaric zeal, so to speak, that they had this he likened it to Dionysius, this god of debauchery and fertility, and just giving into your Freudian id, right? And just having no inhibitions, and going for power, and going for taking over other empires, and having a strong, kind of Genghis Khan type rise. But then you become too civilized, you become too soft, and you pay the price for it. And he said that's the way he was afraid that Western civilization was becoming. He actually didn't think that democracy, representative democracy, was the way to go. He thought it was becoming too decadent, and he wanted more of an autocratic rule, with a strong ruler, right? And so at any rate, yeah, you had that. You had Malthus, who was concerned that there were not enough resources in the world, and the population was growing too exponentially, right? 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, etc. And so that you were going to have this, kind of Mad Max type dystopian fight, this Armageddon coming for scarce resources. Lacombe de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain thought that different races, they were using that term at that time, were going to eventually fight it out for those scarce resources. And so, you if you sat back and were timid, you were going to lose out as a people. Okay. And then you also had Americans who stood up at that time, and like Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan, you see in blue. He got the voice of the Senate. He got the voice of some of those in the Navy, and in the president's cabinet, with his writings, his book, his speeches, etc. And he contended, he tried to put it into a foolproof plan, kind of synthesizing all these ideas together, and contending, right, that America had to engage in aggressive geopolitics. And with geopolitics, right, is you deal with contingency, you deal with the what ifs. You look at a map, right, and you deal with the possible greatest threats that could afflict you in the future. So at this time, we were worried about a rising Germany, for instance. We were still concerned, even though we had an awkward friendship and alliance with Great Britain. Okay, and we were having some awkward incidents, for kind of a euphemism of putting it that way, with Germany in Samoa. And we were also having them in Nicaragua and other areas in Central America with Great Britain. And so we had reason to fear that things could escalate with either one of those countries, for instance, in the 1890s. And so there were threats and with both those countries coming from both ends on multiple occasions. So at any rate, when you look at that, right? So he said, what you do is you look at certain areas on the map, and that you decide certain islands, certain areas that are pivotal, that must be in our hands, right? That must be in our hands. And he said, especially, he said, the future will be fought in naval battles as the world is expanding, and the seas and communication and telecommunications and everything is shrinking the world, metaphorically. And so we're all connected by the seas. And he said the Navy will be pivotal in fighting on the seas. So he said, right, you look at this certain areas in the Caribbean, on kind of our front porch, so to speak. You look at certain areas on our backyard in the Pacific, and you decide, okay, we need to have, for instance, coaling stations. Coaling stations at that time with steam engines for ships were like gas stations, right? You had to burn the coal to fuel the steam engines to get them to go. And so we would have certain key pivotal points out in the vast Pacific and in the Caribbean, where he would say we need to have an agreement with certain island peoples that they can only provide coal for our navy and no one else's, right? And then he said, and then also provide naval yards for our navy to keep some frigates, some battleships, etc., to be stationed just in case, right, of an emergency, etc. And so, but the problem is, right, is what if they say no? And so that's where it becomes more controversial, is you don't let them say no. With aggressive geopolitics, right, you diplomatically impose your will on weaker island peoples, right, by extortion, if need be, by the threat and the use of force or economic extortion, whatever need be, okay? Also, you use a much higher proportion of your annual budget on defense, right? So in 1883, we engaged in for the first time, engaged in $1 billion expenditure on the Naval Appropriations Act in for our Navy. And so you have the naval frigates, the battleships that will become known later on all the way through World War II. The battleships that are the USS, the ones that are named after the states, the ones that were bombed at Pearl Harbor all the way so many years later. That's what we have, the origin of them in 1883. So they were state of the art, obviously, that early. And so, and he was kind of one of the fathers of that. And he got James G. Blaine, the Secretary of State, and other people who were real big on his writings and his his rhetoric to promote this. Okay, and so yeah, that's where you get Alfred Thayer Mahan, and with that. So at any rate, with all this, right, and then you have them another argument as they contend. Okay, and then we have what about the altruistic people? What about the people that really want to do good for other less fortunate people? Because what they make the argument is, hey, these primitive island people, if we don't take them over, someone else will, one of our enemies will, and that will not bode well for us in the future, right? Geopolitically, on the chessboard, so to speak. Or two, they are going to become extinct eventually and die out because they're so backward as a people. So hence, we might as well take them over. And in the process of taking them over, as our burden as a white race, we will help uplift them, these primitive people, and we will teach them the accoutrements of civilization. We will help them, firstly, medically. We'll give them the most up-to-date vaccines, shots. We'll help them with the running water and sewage systems. We'll help them with a school system and education. We'll provide them with representative government and help them be a part of it and participate in it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So notice, right, all of these serve as justification for us contending that we need, not that we can and we have a right to, but we need to get involved overseas. We need to become more aggressive overseas. All right. And then, as these ideas were spreading, we had an episode in the Samoan Islands in which the Germans turned their battleships on us, and just as fate would have it, a hurricane hit and wiped out the German fleet. And they, according to our primary sources, heaven itself saved us, because we could not stand toe to toe with the German fleet. So we could have easily been wiped out by the Germans. We were not prepared, and it was a very humbling experience. In Nicaragua, we told the British to get out. We cited the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, right, from 70 years prior, that the Americas were not to be invaded by the Europeans. And the British ambassador basically laughed at us and asked us what we were going to do about it, knowing we did not have the military might to kick the British out of Nicaragua. And that was humbling for us. We also had an incident with the Spanish, in which the Cubans rose in rebellion against the Spanish in the 1870s. And some Americans came and joined the Cuban rebellion down in Cuba. And they were bringing arms, smuggling them into Cuba. The Spanish caught them red-handed in the boats, and they began executing them right there in the boats. And that violated international law. And the Spanish were very arrogant toward us as a country, and basically had no fear of what the United States would do in retaliation. And that was humiliating to us as well. And then we had a humiliating incident with Chile. Our sailors came into port out of Valparaiso, and they went into a saloon, and there was an altercation, and a few sailors were stabbed to death. And our government demanded that there be reparations paid and a formal apology, and the Chilean government refused to apologize. So there was a sense that we were getting no respect from anybody, and we weren't feared by anybody, and that might bring about, almost like not being feared in prison, that might bring about more pernicious threats in the future, because no one feared us. So all these, right, are tied together with number one, to the feeling amongst our cabinet members and our armed forces, amongst some of those in the White House, that we needed to do something about this. All right. So yeah, take a look at that, as I will definitely put this on here. But notice also just the genuine feeling of paternalism that we exemplified. Look at that awful political cartoon, that caricature of Uncle Sam telling these island people, these quote children, how to properly live in their own islands. And again, I'll post this and let you look at it as long as you like. And then number two, one more trying to defend the U.S., and then I'll change my tune. All right. This one specifically deals with the Spanish-American War. as it pertains to Cuba. Okay, so technically, okay, guys, technically, we sent troops to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to fight against the Spanish, to help all three of those island peoples, the Puerto Ricans, the Cubans, and the Filipinos, to gain independence from Spain. All right. In 1898. However, almost all of the causes, almost the entire, narrative of what led to the war and all the drama spoken of in the White House, and as far as the official causes of the war, pertain to Cuba alone. Okay? To Cuba alone. Which is very geographically close to Florida. So as I mentioned, in the 1870s, Cuba fought for independence from Spain. Well, clearly, it did not win because it had to rise again in 1895 for independence. And 3 years into it, we would eventually help them in 1898. So what happened? Well, in the midst of it, you guys have probably heard the basics of this, and we're just given the basics in this basic U.S. history class. There was a meeting at El Galeon in Cuba. Okay, leaders like Maximo Gomez, Antonio Maceo, they decided that they were going to try to get the United States to help them out. So they decided for sure. It didn't just happen. This was a conscious effort on behalf of the Cuban rebellion to get the United States to come help them. Not only that, one of the ways by which they tried to do so might be considered a bit manipulative. And that is, they consciously mentioned burning the sugar plantations of dual citizens, of those who had both American citizenship and Cuban citizenship in Cuba. And they knew, according to the 5th and the 14th Amendments, the United States government vows to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens. Does that mean of its citizens who are living abroad? It depends on which administration is sitting in the White House. It's varied from administration to administration. All right. So they did. Both sides engaged in such. So the word in Spanish, right, for war is guerra, G-U-E-R-R-A. So guerrilla, G-U-E-R-R-I-L-L-A, is the diminutive of guerra, little warfare. That's exactly what the Cubans did. They engaged in little warfare. They'd break up their lines and not fight in battalions. They'd attack homes and plantations and burn things up and so forth. So things got kind of dirty. The manner by which both sides began to fight on this island. All right. Also, the Cuban rebel leadership sent juntas, Juntas, right? Junta is just a committee. They sent juntas into 2 states where they had a high proportion of Cuban and other Latino demographics, into Florida and into New York. And they tried to drum up anti-Spanish sentiment, and they tried to raise money and try to draw up volunteers to fight against Spain and help the cause of free Cuba, Cuba Libre. All right. President Grover Cleveland at the time, according to, excuse me. Sorry about that. President Grover Cleveland at the time, by his actions as well as by his quoted words, showed a large degree, an element of disgust and discipline, and said he wanted no part of this. He did not want to be sucked into this war for various reasons. All right. Now, granted, from what I've read on Cleveland, it was not so much that he was anti-imperialist, like we would by today's standards, okay, to give him that type of credit by today's, worldview and values, okay. A lot of it, matter of fact, from what I've read in his quote, speaking to the subsequent president, McKinley, were financial, and saying that a war would be expensive and costly, and he wanted no part of it. But nevertheless, the result was the result. At the same time, so to speak, in a sense, perhaps, he wanted no part of this war. Okay. So at any rate, then the press gets involved. And yes, it is true that people like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst boasted that, telling their photographers, "You furnish me the pictures and I'll furnish the war." One of them said that, supposedly, in an anecdote. Such was the arrogance that, I could push this credulous public back in the US into pushing for war just by creating such a sense of outrage with the right pictures and stories. Right. And so for one, they found a willing villain, and that was Valeriano Weyler. Okay, the butcher Weyler. And that's the third guy here. Right here. Okay. He implemented a policy called reconcentración. He was tired of going into villages, right? It was kind of like us later with Vietnam. He'd go into a village, claim that it was pacified because everyone would want no part of the Spanish, say they were not his enemies, and offer no resistance. And then as soon as he'd leave, he and his men would be sniped at and so forth. So he would just go to a village and say, I don't want to have to worry about the people of that village when I turn my back on them. And so he would fence them in into these camps. But look at that young boy beside him. Toward the end of the war, months into it, they would malnourish. They'd have malnourishment. They wouldn't feed the people in them. And so they would have the photographers come and take pictures of this stuff. Okay. And disease spread by putting so many of them together, fenced in. So for a long time, the president refused to recognize the Cuban Republic, because that's recognizing Cuba as its own separate sovereign country. And Spain would be furious, right, as recognize them as its own republic, and there'd be repercussions with Spain. So Cleveland wanted no part of that as president. All right. But the press, right, in Stephen Kinzer's book called Overthrow, and Ivan Muzikant's book called Empire by Default, they contend that the press helped undergo one of history's most radical turns of popular opinion in modern history. So that there's evidence of a strong outcry amongst the American public for help for the Cuban cause, help for the Cuban people, help for a free and independent Cuba. So like it says here, before long, the Senate and the House of Congress passed resolutions to recognize the Cuban Republic, even offering $50 million to the president to prepare the armed forces in case of future conflict. None of these factions or events, however, succeeded in convincing President Cleveland to enter this conflict. He simply ignored Senator James Cameron's congressional demand for the president to recognize the nation of Cuba. He declared neutrality in the Cuban affair. So he stayed out of it, even when the national legislator tried to push him into it, even when a public outcry tried to push him into it, even when the press tried to push him into it. Right? And then here's something else to think about. Is according to historian Kristen Hoganson, she says that there is a spirit of every age, a zeitgeist. And she said, in this age of social Darwinism, of Nietzsche writing that there has to be, an animalistic, barbarian revival, she said that this, of all ages, was an age of machismo. That if you wanted to be elected into office, you better appear to be strong and manly, and to have no weakness, no cowardice, etc. And in comes McKinley. McKinley had already developed a reputation for being very, very timid as a senator. People would attack him verbally as a senator from Ohio, and he would always take the high road and wouldn't attack back. He just wouldn't. He always took the high road, seemingly. Now, don't get me wrong, he wasn't a perfect saint. He was arguably a puppet of big business, according to many. But he just wouldn't get in the mud when it came to slugging it out with somebody in the Senate. But when he came in there into the presidency, it didn't take long, and there was a Depart de Lomé, the De Lomé letter, from Spain. And he writes a letter and he says, "Oh, don't worry. I don't think the US is going to come to war with us, Spain." He goes, "Because I don't think this new president has much of a backbone." And a British diplomat confiscates his letter and gives it to an American journalist. And they put it all throughout the newspapers that a Spanish diplomat calls the new American president a spineless wimp. And of this generation, of all generations, then he goes to the Senate and he has people give him, try to hit him where they think it really will matter because he's a money man. And they tell him about how much money is being lost in Cuba, especially regarding American Cuban dual nationals, with all the plantations being burnt, the sugar plantations, all that, right? I can't remember how many million, but they had it up there in the tens of millions. And he just was silent. He was silent. So look what Senator Chandler says to Congress. "We will declare war in spite of him, in spite of McKinley." So obviously the senators are thinking the same thing of McKinley as they did of his predecessor. That this guy, we're going to have to declare war without him. This president also does not want to go to war. However, right, he is a typical politician in that he wants to be reelected. And he knows he can't look like a wimp for too long. So there was a famous bullfighter who came into Havana, Cuba, and the Cubans took advantage of it and protested from people around the world coming to Havana, Cuba to watch this bullfighter. And they used it, right, to bring attention to their cause. Well, the Spanish cracked down on them for everyone to see and made mass arrests and, cracked some heads. And word got out that some of them were dual nationals who had American citizenship. So he says, "Okay, I need to at least send a message. No violence, but just send a message." So those nice fancy ships we have, right? Those intimidating looking ships, he's going to send one right into Havana Harbor just to remind the Spanish that we're just a telegram away. The USS Maine. He puts it in there, and it was there for about 6 weeks. And supposedly it was pretty awkward. But at one time, they even invited a couple Spanish officers into there and gave them something to eat and drink and saw them away. But in February, it blew up of 1898. And what do you know? The Americans sent a scuba diving team that found evidence of an inward explosion. The Spanish scuba diving team found evidence of an outward explosion. So the outward explosion looked like near the steam engine that it was an accident. The inward explosion looked like evidence of a mine that was placed on the outside of the ship. But look what he says, even after that, and the death of these Americans. He says, I do not propose to be swept off my feet. So even after these Americans die, right, killing about 250 Americans, he still does not ask Congress to declare war. So time goes by, and now he begins to ask for money to get prepared for war. He says, I've tried prepared to do everything, but if I must have to go to war, I must be prepared. So he's preparing for the possibility. But here's what he does that results in it. He issues Spain an ultimatum. Spain must end the rebellion by a certain date, or by that certain date, come to terms by which both sides agree, or else the U.S. is going to get involved. When that date lapsed, then he asked Congress to go to war. That is the official reason why we went to war with Spain in the Spanish-American War. All right. So with number 2, right? Contending, we're not the bully. Both our presidents were the quiet guy that was pushed into the fight. We were dragged into that war. And then number 3, we start revisionist history. President McKinley was a hypocritical puzzle. He was an enigma. Okay, yeah, he stayed out of the war. But why did he engage? Why did he give Spain an ultimatum that he knew, he must have known, Spain could not meet? I'm almost hinting, was he secretly by that time wanting to go to war? See, by that time, they had a change in the administration in Spain to a liberal government and prime minister, Projeda Sagasta. And he offered autonomy decrees, basically offering like Canada has under England and Great Britain to these people, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And guess what? Puerto Rico accepted. But Cuba and the Philippines, they made it clear they would accept nothing short of complete independence. And the whole world knew that. And they've been fighting for years. So then we're telling them, okay, they have about 3 months to put down this rebellion or come to terms with the rebels. And we knew the rebels would accept nothing but complete independence. And we knew Spain would not accept just letting them go and giving them complete independence. So we knew that this ultimatum wouldn't work. The Pope intervened and said, please, just buy more time. Let me intervene and see what I can do. And President McKinley said, nope. So then as soon as we intervene, he said, okay, we're sending troops to Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And even the leaders of his armed forces were like, excuse me, sir? I thought we were just fighting for Cuba. He said, no, most of the naval forces of Spain are in Manila, the Philippines, which was true. So, okay, I'll grant you that. Okay, but that's just Manila. Then we don't need to get out of the boats, just Manila. But, oh, we got out of the boats. We fought in the major islands, the Philippines. And then what about also Puerto Rico? Do you know that our soldiers were warned about Puerto Rico? Hey, they accepted the autonomy decrees of Spain. They're actually on good terms with Spain. So we don't know how they're going to accept us. So beware, be ready for anything. So how does that, equate with us coming in as their savior? And we still have them in an awkward position to this day. And then we said, right, we're going to give them representative governments. All right, well, look at the Malolos Constitution, as I have in here somewhere, in the Philippines. It's modeled after the United States Constitution. We said no. We said, oh, no, don't be silly, Filipinos. You're not ready for that. So we had these three-man regional executives, 2 Americans and 1 Filipino. We had a lower national legislature of Filipinos elected and an upper house of handpicked Americans with veto power over them. Really? That's the kind of enlightened democratic government that we wanted to give them? In Puerto Rico, we want to take them away from an oligarchy that the Spanish have. Read about the economy that we created in Puerto Rico. We created these sugar and coffee barons that monopolized most of the good land on that little island and enriched themselves at the expense of most of the Puerto Rican people. Excuse me. Number 4 is pretty self-explanatory. U.S. pursuing its economic interest even at others' nations' expense. Remember, plutocratic is when a nation, when the governing authorities are the puppets of the rich. Okay? Are the puppets of the rich. And that's what we have here. The depiction of this on number 4. So we send these ambassadors Charles Denby, these others, to China. And all they do is they just jockey for a position, Horace Allen, for our big companies to have a chance to exploit these Asian markets and these Asian resources. As if that were not enough blatant realpolitik, openly pursuing one nation's best geopolitical and economic interest, even if at the expense of other nations. In China, Cleveland Secretary of State Bayard, Minister to China Denby, and diplomat Horace Allen tried to simultaneously negotiate Korea's separation from China and American economic investments in Korea. In the mid-1890s, amidst an economic depression in the U.S., Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Minister Denby pushed for the presence of more American naval ships near China, especially as a symbol of protection for missionaries and businessmen. Minister to China Charles Denby specifically lobbied for Chinese commercial contacts for specific American companies, like Cramp Shipbuilding Company, Bethlehem Iron Company, and several railroad and banking syndicates. Okay, and it just goes on. Look at this one. American bureaucrats armed and supported Hippolyte's internal Haitian rebellion against its uncooperative leader, Legitime, in return for a concession to the U.S. of a naval station and an American steamship's monopoly transit to and from America. So now we're actually arming and helping one faction in another government and country to overthrow another faction just so that they can return the favor of giving us economic privileges. That's crazy. For instance, in the Cherokee province was virtually owned by the United Fruit Company by the late 1840s, while the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and United States Magdalena Steam Navigation Company nearly monopolized transportation to and from Panama via steamship and river business contracts from Colombia and across it. They built railroads from east to west by the late 1840s, making a killing when hundreds of thousands of people from across the globe chose Panama to get from the Atlantic to Pacific during California's world-famous gold rush. Known as filibusters, American businessmen with personal armies proliferated throughout Latin America, even brazenly trying to take over national governments, as William Walker did in Nicaragua. It's just crazy to me that they could do that. Zamuri was the banana man. And then you could read about like the dirty things we did for the Panama Canal. And then I try to go in a good direction again with number 5. Present censure of American imperialism in the Philippines ought to be mitigated by the presence of some good intentions. And I try to show how the progressives, we're going to do the progressives next week, try to do some good things to help the Filipino people out. That there were people who actually gave up their time and their resources to try to educate and help give hope and a future to the people of the Philippines. And we're very proud of what they did. Now, by today's standards, you might find it to be very condescending and arrogant. But take a look at it if you would. All right, this is just old note stuff. I know this is one of, if not the longest one I have. All right, so are there any questions or comments?
No.
All right, thank you. All right, you guys. Well, I'll go ahead then and bid you adieu, and I will put this online for you, okay?
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
No, anytime. Thank you for your patience, okay?